Hey everyone, Rick Cody here, pastor of St. Paul Lutheran Church in Wichita Falls, Texas. I thought I would give you a rundown on what we talked about yesterday in the sermon. Yesterday was Lent 1, and we talked about the significance of remembering. And God had led the Israelites out of Egypt, their suffering that they had done there for so many years. And whenever they got to the promised land, he had the command to them to take some of the first fruits of the land, and then they would put it in a basket. They would bring it over to the priests. And whenever they got to the priests, then they were to recite the reading that was on there, recalling their time in Egypt, where it starts off a wandering Aramean, and then it just continues on, and then they recited this entire paragraph. But what that did was gave them the opportunity to offer, first of all, some first fruits back to God for bringing them out of their suffering in Egypt, but it also gave them the opportunity to remember his goodness every year. And so there were 7 festivals that the Israelite people would participate in each year, and each one would recall a particular event in the life of his people. And so I also included the idea of how important it is for us to remember things too when it came to our relationship with God and the kinds of things that we experience throughout our Christian faith life. One of the things that I remember as a young boy was being in worship with my grandmother. And we would sit there in the worship service. And of course, I was too young to go up to the Lord's Supper at this particular point in my life. But every time that she and the other people around us would come back from the Lord's Supper, I got this sensation in my nose, the same familiar smell that I had every week. And I remember one time just leaning over and asking my grandmother, "Grandma, what is that smell I keep smelling?" And I remember her leaning over to me and saying, "Honey, that smell is Jesus." And I've never forgotten that. That's been something that's been impressed on my memory as if it were just yesterday. And it's really been something that's helped me develop my own faith life and to realize that when we go up to the Lord's Supper, we're really taking the true body and blood of our Savior Jesus, because Jesus is really there. Something else that I wanted to bring up was the fact that we here at St. Paul are celebrating 125 years of being a church here in Wichita Falls and in the North Texas area. And so there's a lot of remembering going on this year. And so I brought up the idea that people could walk into the sanctuary, people that have been members here for all their lives. They've walked into the sanctuary, they've smelled the sanctuary because it's got a specific smell to it. There are the hymnals that help it make it smell, the pews, the altar, everything in the church just has that sensation that we have, and it helps us remember things. We look at the stained glass windows, we look at, again, the altar, the statue of Jesus up in the front, the pulpit and the lectern and the paraments. Everything communicates something, and it usually points to something outside of itself, and that thing that it points to would be Christ. And so they can remember vacation Bible schools, they can remember their confirmations, perhaps their weddings, family funerals, all kinds of different things that they can remember here at St. Paul. And so another thing that I wanted them to do was to look forward, not just backwards, but forward. Look forward to some new things that will become memories for new people. And we started having the Lord's Supper every Sunday this last week. And this is something that I've tried to do as a pastor at all the congregations that I've served. I've had the blessed opportunity to serve 5 different congregations over the last 25 years. And each congregation, thanks be to God, were willing to go to the Lord's Supper every Sunday, because in the Lord's Supper, Jesus has given us something to remember. We know that every time we go to the Lord's Supper, we are not only receiving the bread and the wine in the Lord's Supper, but also the body and blood of our Savior Jesus. It was his last will and testament to his church to give us that, and he gave it to us so that we would remember him because we proclaim in the liturgy that every time we take the Lord's Supper, we proclaim the Lord's death until he comes again. And I hope you see how important that is, that we do this as a congregation, because historically speaking, going back to the book of Acts, that's what they did every time they gathered together. And even the early church writings, the Didache, says that every time that the church came together on Sundays, on the Lord's Day, it says, they would have the Lord's Supper. And so the Lord's Supper fell out of disuse in the church, and that's one of the things that Luther gave back to the church during the time of the Reformation. He reinstituted the use of every Sunday communion. And so this fell out of disuse once again during the 18th and 19th century with the rise of pietism and rationalism and some other things that were blocking, really, the Lord's Supper in the church. And so I'm very happy to say that as of about 25 years ago, the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod did vote in convention to encourage all congregations to try to recapture the historic practice of every Sunday communion. And so, happy to say that we've done this. We are remembering, we are proclaiming the Lord's death until he comes. I am glad that you stopped by and that you are watching this video and maybe even remembering something of your own childhood and your own church experience, because memory is important. One last story that I'll share with you before I close off. I remember as a child going to the old Lutheran parish hall at my congregation down in Tomball, Texas, and I remember walking into the old white school building when we would have the old German festival. And as I'm telling you this story, I can literally smell the sauerkraut that was being cooked in that parish hall way back, and I guarantee you this had to have been at least probably 38 to 40 years ago. It is a very awesome memory for me, and I just remember very fondly so many different things about my childhood and growing up. And I hope that's the same for you. I hope that you will find Jesus in the liturgy, in his word, in his sacraments, and rejoice in the fact that he has given us, through those things, forgiveness, life, and salvation. God's blessings be upon you. The Lord be with you, and thanks for watching, and we'll get back with you soon.